My name is Rich Bodie. I'm here with NewsNation's Robert Sherman, who's live on the ground reporting for us in Ukraine right now. Robert, I want to just start right off the top with those air raid sirens that went off just moments ago. Tell us what you're hearing, what you're seeing now.
Yeah, Rich, we just had sirens blaring here in Kyiv just a short while ago here. The all clear was given just a couple of minutes ago now. This is the everyday reality that Ukrainians are dealing with here as they try and carry on everyday lives. But the threats that exist here from the Russian military are rather constant. And, I think just to shed a little bit of light on how a lot of these air raid sirens work, it's actually a conversation that's taking place in Ukraine because it depends what Russia is putting in the air as to where exactly these sirens go off. So if the Russian Air Force puts fighter jets or bombers into the air, then actually sirens will go off in every district here in Ukraine because in theory, the Russian Air Force has the ability to touch, target, and decimate any square inch here in Ukraine. So that's why you have sirens that go off perhaps not even where the strike will be coming, but the alert is given to everybody. Now, if it's a Russian drone or Russian missile, then the alerts are a bit more pinpoint. But the reality is that what you look at here is a very capable Russian military. And as a result, you have these wide sweeping alerts that go off here. You have to take them seriously, though, because just a couple of days ago, when we had the sirens blaring here, we saw the single deadliest attack in Kyiv since 2024, in which over 30 people were killed. So you really just can't operate with this confidence that when the siren goes off, it's not going to target you because it very well could. And so that is the day-to-day kind of life that people are living here. Again, it appears as though that the the alerts have been given the all clear here where we are in Kyiv, still waiting on any initial reports as to exactly what was put in the air and where exactly was targeted here in Ukraine. But this is rather constant here, and you see this threat of Russian attacks practically daily.
Well, I do want to get to your exclusive reporting on drones here in a minute, but today, obviously, the start of President Trump's self-imposed deadline to make that deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war. And it was in Scotland where President Trump lowered that 50-day threshold from 10 to 12 days. So maybe today, maybe Sunday. But Robert, how do you think that plays out? Do you think we see more economic sanctions on Russia's partners prior to the potential face-to-face meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to the president's words, I mean, especially the Oval Office yesterday, it's very clear that he is practically at its wit's end with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Basically said it's up to Putin if they adhere to this deadline or not. And the president has not minced words about the prospects of further economic sanctions coming down. We already saw the United States jacking up the tariff rate on India by 25%. That's part of the secondary tariff strategy that the White House is using to pinch Russia by going after some of their major trade partners, particularly those who purchase large amounts of Russian oil, and India falls into that category. China does as well, though we haven't seen additional secondary tariffs imposed on China here to this juncture yet. It's really hard to say, Rich, because, I mean, especially if you take it from the Ukrainian perspective here, I'll be frank, there's low optimism here that much of anything is going to happen because they've been down this road before. They've heard countless world leaders in the Western world say, if Putin doesn't comply to X, we will punish them with Y economic sanction. And you see the world that we live in today, 3.5 years later, the day-to-day life for everyday Ukrainians really hasn't changed all that much. So that's why people have rather low optimism that just about anything is going to happen. And then the bigger, broader thing is that there's inherent distrust towards Russia. Consummate example is that we live right now in a present world in which this is deadline day, and you just had air raid sirens going off here. Not to mention the fact that at about 9 o'clock this morning, we had air raid sirens here. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, we had air raid sirens here as well. So, I mean, this has been happening throughout the day here as we swiftly approach this deadline that has been imposed by the White House here. So very clearly, if the benchmark is, and it's not 100% clear what the precise benchmark is, if it's an outright ceasefire, if it's pretty close to a ceasefire. But if the benchmark is a ceasefire, we're clearly not there right now if you have air raid sirens going off. There's still time in all of this, and an unfortunate common reality that you see in a lot of wars is that if a ceasefire is coming in the next few hours, you almost always see both sides trying to get their last few punches in before that ceasefire comes down from a strategic position of trying to knock out any enemy weaponry or enemy strategic sites before the fighting comes to a cease. This is rather common that you see in wars. So that doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that we're going to get to that point yet, but very clearly, there's certainly no added grace period that's being added to all of this, with the sirens just a few minutes ago being evidence to that.
Yeah, and just to your point, ceasefire. Do you think we see that a deal, bilateral meeting, and a site for that bilateral meeting announced by Sunday?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, the rumblings that we keep getting from the White House is that they're shooting for next week here, and the rhetoric that's coming out of the Kremlin seems to give optimism that there's going to be diplomacy of some capacity that takes place in the next couple of days here, and they seem to be rather confident that there's going to be a face-to-face meeting. Particularly when you heard the president say that there is no prerequisite for Russian President Vladimir Putin to meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky beforehand. So that prerequisite has been taken off the table here, which potentially makes what is required in order to have a meeting taking place a bit more easy here. In terms of locations, I mean, you heard the Kremlin, the Russian president throwing out the idea of the UAE. There seems to be that initial indication that this is going to take place on a neutral site when it does happen, which does make sense. And we've kind of heard that line being walked here for the last couple of months. In terms of, bilateral, trilateral meetings, we know that the Ukrainians are preparing for all possible scenarios here. That's what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. But the point being is that the Ukrainians want a seat at the table here. And the reason for that is if you listen to what the Russian leader is saying publicly here, there is a list of demands that Russia has that they have put into the public sphere for them to move towards a ceasefire. That list of demands includes no NATO membership for Ukraine, vows to not be joining NATO, territorial concessions in places that the Russian military doesn't even occupy at this point. I mean, you're talking about communities that are even west of the front lines that you're looking at. And on top of all of that, you're also looking for widespread demilitarization here in Ukraine. That list of demands that Russia has put out is overwhelmingly, you look at the public surveys, being rejected by the Ukrainian public. So to get to a point where we get to a deal, there would have to be significant negotiations that take place here in order to talk the Russians down from that stance. Now, can that be done? Can President Trump deliver something like that? It's quite possible. But based upon what the Russian leadership is saying, even as of this week, there's still a gap that needs to be bridged between these two sides.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, does it become a thing where Vladimir Zelensky has to be in the room for those discussions to take place and for those, details to be hammered out? It sounds like that's sort of the direction where this is moving. No?
It could be a sticking point because when you listen to President Putin this week, he said on the one hand, he's not opposed to meeting with President Zelensky, but on the other hand, he said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing the Russian, but the conditions have not been met for something like that to happen here. So there's posturing that's coming from the Kremlin. Is that just digging heels in the sand for the sake of public rhetoric? Do the Russians come down from that and ultimately meet with Zelensky? We don't know yet. Those details have not been hashed out yet. But I mean, it seems as though there's the possibility that this takes a couple of bilateral forms between Trump and Putin, and then Trump and Zelensky, or an outright trilateral form. But right now, the Russians are saying that they're not quite ready for the face-to-face with Zelensky.
Well, I want to get to your exclusive reporting that we saw Wednesday and Thursday. It's online now for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I want to start with drones. We're in this new era of warfare with these drones. So I'm going to play some of what we saw from your story. Let's see, here we go. And, Robert, if you can just walk us through, tell us what we're seeing here.
Yeah, well, this is one of the Ukrainian drone workshops that's just a couple of miles away from the front lines that we were given exclusive access to. And this is where these developments and advancements in modern warfare are taking place every single day. I mean, you see what these drones are capable of on your screen right there. I mean, these small craft drones, I mean, practically the same thing that you could buy at Best Buy or any of these stores that you have in the United States for a couple $100. That's fundamentally what these are, these small craft drones. They can be manufactured for a couple $100. When you attach explosives to them, you've created a weapon. And that weapon has been demonstrated again and again to be able to inflict damage to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. You think about it, if a drone scores a direct hit on a tank or a fighter jet, you have caused significant amount of damage at a pretty low price. So this is the crafty, cunning strategy that the Ukrainians are right now using on the front lines, and is largely the reason that the Russian advance has been slowed to the extent that it has up to this juncture here. Now, that being said, something important here is that over the last year or so, the Ukrainians have really pioneered, developed this technology. I mean, you see new prototypes that are in the works and new pieces of technology that are about to hit the front lines, most likely in the next couple of weeks here. That's how quickly this is moving. But for every advancement the Ukrainians are making, they begrudgingly acknowledge that the Russians have effectively closed the gap over the last year. And left behind in all of this, the United States and NATO. You know, that's not my analysis. That's even coming from the horse's mouth of the Defense Department themselves, that they're watching this war take place overseas, thousands of miles away, and this new kind of warfare is being pioneered, and the United States hasn't really invested in it up until now. And now there's a push that is coming from the Pentagon and the Defense Department in order to catch up, but very much so behind the eight ball on this.
Yeah, and former Ambassador James Jeffrey saying this morning with Marky Martin in Morning in America that, hey, listen, you know, this is a situation that's still fluid, and these drones, obviously, you know, causing a lot of damage, but still, you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin only taking about 900 kilometers worth of land, which he's equated to Patton taking that in one day. So I thought that was very interesting too. I do want to play a soundbite here from your story. Now let's take a listen into
I think
this.
America still is not prepared to this.
So you're at the ground level of this new innovative warfare.
Yeah.
You're saying the United States is not prepared for the new era of warfare that's already here.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's not prepared. And still doesn't see like that it can be a problem.
I mean, we listen to that, you know, you're in this covert location where the Ukrainians are making drones. First of all, do you think he's right? And then the comment that struck me the most is, you know, you said people who thought they were safe now aren't. Is that in part due to the drones?
Yeah, 100%. You know, I mean, from everything that I've seen over the last couple of days here, I'm very convinced that the United States is way behind and not prepared for this new era of warfare that is here. Because, I mean, what we couldn't take photos and videos of are the prototypes that are coming, that are going to hit the front lines. I just can't even begin to articulate, you know, how far in advance they're already thinking, and the new technologies that they're putting into the field of play. And we haven't even caught up to the Ukrainians in the present moment here. That's how quickly all of this is moving. They even said that the technology that you see that they're using today is going to be out of date in about 2 months. And this is the way that wars go, is that a technology finds effectiveness and it works for a couple of months. Then your adversary finds a way in order to counter that technology. So what do? Then you have to go back to the drawing board and find a way to get past that counter mechanism. Then the counter mechanism develops. So it is this unconventional arms race that has taken place between both of these sides here, driven by need, because the Ukrainians are very outspoken and very clear that in a traditional war, in a conventional war against Russia, they can't win. So they need to double down on this unconventional kind of warfare. And they feel convinced that the Russians will not be able to fully take Ukraine using conventional warfare alone. The Russians would have to double down in turn on unconventional warfare, which you're seeing that they're starting to do. The Ukrainians also told us this story about how one of their drone commanders was brought to a NATO base, and the NATO leadership asked them, you know, do you see vulnerabilities here at this NATO base? And the Ukrainian response was 4 drone teams could take this NATO base in just a couple of minutes. Yeah, I have no way of personally verifying if that's true or not. I'm not a drone tech, but if that is true, every Western defense department should be taking a hard look at this technology, or at the very least, the defense mechanisms to defend against such a technology here, because it's totally new and it's off the walls. And the Ukrainians, the reason the Ukrainians agreed to show us this technology is because they believe the United States and the West has severe vulnerabilities and blind spots that the Russians are about to be in a position to take advantage of if push comes to shove. And if, there's a world that we live in which NATO and Russia end up going toe to toe, there would be a disadvantage for NATO in this capacity here. So that's the reason the Ukrainians even agreed to show us this technology in the first place.
Very interesting. I mean, it's all sort of a scary new reality that we live in here. But you also, I want to get to your other exclusive reporting about a Ukrainian group of women protecting the country called the Witches of Bucha. And let's get to that video here so we can show everyone this. And this is just one of the people who are doing this right now. Correct, Robert?
Yeah, this is one woman who we spoke with, Elena, who obviously, is one of those everyday civilians who has a normal day job during, the daylight hours in which, she's a mom. She has her own massage therapy business on the side. She spends time doing mixed martial arts fighting in her free time. But now, when the war broke out, there is this all hands on deck mentality that has been created. And now her responsibility is to defend Kyiv, where we are, and the surrounding areas against Russian drones. I mean, they sit out in the woods, and their objective is to shoot down these Shahed drones, many of them which were initially pioneered by Iran, just about every single night. There were over 6,000 of these drones that were launched by Russia at Ukraine in the month of July alone. So it is a tense job. There are constant threats, and these responsibilities are falling to people who, maybe for the first time in their life are picking up a weapon. But that is the all hands on deck mentality that has been created by this war here. And this unit of soldiers is nearly all women who is doing this. And that's significant here in Ukraine because it wasn't until 2017 that women couldn't even serve in combat roles here in Ukraine. That's now long gone, particularly with the fact that the Russian military has conducted this invasion, is currently on the doorstep. They need all the help that they can get with the major losses that you are seeing on both sides of this war up to this point. And it just shows, this everyday civilian mentality is having to be transitioned into these combat roles in order to protect the homeland. I mean, this is what is happening on the ground here in Ukraine as they go up against an adversary who is, has more funding, has more manpower and more firepower. These are the everyday needs that are on the ground in Ukraine.
Well, Robert, it was an incredible story. So thank you for reporting that. I have been reading your newsletter too, which for those of you who haven't, it's Frontlines with Robert Sherman. You can find it online. In one of your latest posts, though, you said that Ukrainians felt the sanctions President Trump put on India for buying Russian oil weren't something that they saw as a long-term solution for peace. But let's just say India, like many countries, starts to feel the economic pressure, then caves to the Trump administration's demands and these tariffs. Do you think isolation is the not-so-secret White House strategy for dealing with Russia?
100%. I mean, I think that you hit the nail right on the head there, Rich. That is clearly the objective here is that, okay, if the direct economic sanctions on Russia aren't working, then put pressure on Russia by targeting some of their major trade partners. And in theory, if India is feeling pinched by these new level of tariffs, maybe India in turn puts pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table. Now, we know Russian President Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi had a conversation here today, and the Indian leadership is, relooking at, the amount of arms that they purchase from the United States. So this is a double-edged sword. It could push Russia to the negotiating table, or it could push major countries and economies such as India away from the United States and towards Russia. But it's a gamble, right? I mean, it's a gamble that the president is taking, and the White House believes that this is a gamble that could pay off because at this juncture, the standard tariffs have not, and the standard economic sanctions have not really had an ultimate impact on moving Russia away from the war that we're currently seeing. I mean, in fact, I mean, when you look at the economy of Russia itself, it's practically a wartime economy that they're operating under right now. And in the present moment here. So, I mean, at this juncture, the economic sanctions that you have seen levied on Russia have not necessarily moved Russia, in any capacity when it comes to the war in Ukraine. That's even by the president's own admission. And he described Russia as wily, was his word, when it comes to their ability to evade a lot of these tariffs and a lot of these sanctions. So they're trying a new course of action here. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I have a funny feeling that we're all going to find out in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Now, that's what I was wondering myself, too. Is it something that we're going to find out soon? I want to ask you one more question. I know you're very busy, and I know you have other hits, but I want to point out something specific because I almost laughed when I read it the first time. You described this scene in one of your newsletters where you're at a McDonald's in Kyiv getting coffee. And I'm picturing you standing there just looking at the board, trying to decide what you want. And I think sometimes in war coverage, it's hard for just people in general to perceive this reality of you being on the front lines and what that really looks like day in and day out. And you said your direct quote was, "It almost looks normal." And yet here you are, just when we began the live stream, where sirens were going off across Ukraine. And that day specifically, there was a large-scale Russian missile attack headed your way while you're at McDonald's. So to the point where you mentioned Ukraine's essentially having to live underground, and that's also a normal, do you think there's this mix or maybe a general sense that maybe, at least maybe in some parts of Ukraine, that yes, there's a war, but everyone's still kind of going about their lives?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, especially if you look at the communities in Western Ukraine, I mean, I think that, I mean, from what we've seen, I mean, we drove through the city of Lutsk, which is not far away from the Polish border, and like practically does look normal there. Because, I mean, it's very far removed from the front lines, which is very different than when we were here at the beginning of the war, when quite literally every square inch of this country was in play. And there were airstrikes that were taking place in Western Ukraine at a lot of the airports and a lot of the, potential military sites. So it's different now. The battle lines have been drawn. There's entrenchment. There's a war of attrition that is taking place. Much of the fighting is happening in the east. But I have friends who are journalists who are in Kharkiv right now. And, they said that there are people who are going to nightclubs, not, just a couple of miles away from sovereign Russian soil, quite literally on the front lines of all of this. And people still going to bars, still going to cafes. And what I would say to that, Rich, is that in many cases, this is a sign of protest that Ukrainians have against Russia, is that by carrying, to the most extent that they can, carrying on a normal life is a way of saying to Russia that you can't win, hold this over Ukrainian society for 3.5 years. People are trying their best in order to go on here. Now, there are some communities that, some of the places that we were in towards the front lines in which life looks far from normal, in which it really looks like a classic ghost town in the way that people have cleared out. There's the bombed out buildings, and it's eerie, to see, just how sparsely populated, some of these communities, that 3.5 years were thriving now are today. So it's a mixed bag of where you are. But this is an element that we've heard from Ukrainians is that they want to push forward as much as they can. They want to lead a normal life as much as they can, because they feel so if they don't, if they change their everyday living too much, if they give up on trying to lead, any kind of social life or communal life, then they feel as though Russia wins. So I mean, that is the, the sternness that you get from some Ukrainians here as they try and carry on.
I mean, it's definitely it definitely shows, and it comes through in your reporting. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. For those watching, Robert has a book coming out soon, Lessons from the Front. So we'll be looking forward to that. And Robert, I'm looking forward to reading it. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Rich, for having me. Appreciate it. That's down by 1 compared to the original forecast that came out in May.